The fact that Tony Soprano lived as long as he did seems almost unnatural. For a man who routinely manipulated, intimidated, and exploited everyone around him, the idea that nobody successfully plotted his downfall isn't just a coincidence. It's a reflection of something much deeper about the way power, perception, and dependency operate in The Sopranos. You can list names, of course. Ralph Cifaretto, Richie, Tony Blundetto, Jr. Soprano. All of them had moments where things could have gone sideways. But the fascinating thing is not that Tony survived these moments. It's that he kept surviving them. The show constantly teases the possibility of his demise, but it never truly comes from within his own crew. That's the puzzle. How does a man so consistently self-destructive, paranoid, and cruel maintain enough control that nobody ever takes him out? It starts with fear. Tony mastered the psychological game of violence without always needing to use it. Everyone who came into his orbit knew, at some level, what he was capable of. He didn't have to whack you to prove it. He only had to let you believe he could. The death of Pussy Bonpensiero left a permanent scar on the crew. Puss wasn't just another guy. He was one of Tony's oldest friends. When Tony had him taken out for flipping, it wasn't simply about sending a message to the FBI. It was about sending a message to everyone else. It told them that nobody, not even the people closest to him, were safe if they crossed the line. That single moment reshaped the psychology of the entire organization. It's why, from that point on, people didn't just respect Tony, they feared him on a level that almost resembled superstition. He became untouchable, not because he was invincible, but because nobody wanted to be the one who tried. Even the men who came closest to challenging him, Richie, Ralph Cifaretto, Feach LaManna, all made the same mistake. They underestimated just how much the idea of Tony's dominance had rooted itself into the collective consciousness of the crew. Richie tried to assert his old-school status, but Tony had already rewritten the rules of what power looked like in that world. Ralph was more cunning, but his arrogance blinded him to how isolated he'd become. Once Tony turned on him, there was no one left to protect him. Feach tried to reclaim his old territory, but Tony neutralized him before things could even escalate. These weren't just victories. They were reminders to everyone else. Don't even think about it. The irony is that the one man who actually tried to whack Tony wasn't a rival. It was his own uncle. Junior's botched attempt wasn't born out of ambition or resentment, but confusion, dementia, and manipulation. He didn't even fully understand what he was doing by that point. And even then, Tony's survival became symbolic. It reinforced the mythology around him, that somehow, no matter who took a shot, Tony always made it out alive. In that sense, his reputation became its own armor. But the longer you look, the clearer it becomes that fear alone doesn't explain it. There's another layer, one rooted in dependency. Every man in that crew needed Tony more than they hated him. He wasn't just their boss, he was their lifeline. He controlled access to money, jobs, protection, and legitimacy. Even when he disrespected them or shorted them, the system revolved around his decisions. And once a man holds the keys to your livelihood, plotting against him becomes more than a betrayal. It becomes suicide. Paulie, for example, had every reason to resent Tony by the later seasons. Tony constantly belittled him, shorted him on money, and mocked his loyalty. But Paulie couldn't imagine life outside the structure Tony created. He was institutionalized in the truest sense. He needed the hierarchy to feel like someone. Tony was the structure that kept his identity intact. To move against Tony would mean dismantling the only system that gave him meaning. Silvio, on the other hand, represents the pure company man. He might have had the intelligence to take control, but not the drive. He understood better than anyone what happened to people who reached too far. He saw what happened to Richie, to Ralphie, to Johnny Sack. Men who couldn't balance ego with discipline. Silvio's loyalty wasn't blind. It was pragmatic. As long as Tony was alive, Silvio could thrive in his shadow. Christopher's situation was different. There were moments when you could see flashes of resentment, even hatred, toward Tony. The constant humiliation, the manipulation, the way Tony always reminded him of his weakness. There was an emotional buildup that could have led to violence, but it never did, because Christopher's internal war wasn't about power, it was about approval. He wanted Tony to love him, not fear him. His desire for validation kept him chained, and Tony knew exactly how to keep that leash tight. What makes Tony's survival even more interesting is how he manipulated chaos. Most mob bosses enforce order. Tony weaponized disorder. He created just enough tension, paranoia, and instability that nobody ever felt secure enough to act against him. His crew members were constantly at each other's throats, distracted by their own issues, hustles, and fears. Tony didn't need to micromanage. He just needed to make sure everyone's attention stayed on their own survival. Take Carlo Gervasi near the end. He flipped once the writing was on the wall, but up until that point, he stayed quiet. Why? Because even in the final stretch, Tony's control extended beyond fear of death. It was the belief that betraying him was worse than dying. Tony had built a myth so dense that even men facing prison would rather roll the dice on his good graces than cross him. Another crucial reason no one tried to whack Tony was how he personalized his power. He wasn't just the boss. He made every member feel seen, even when he was manipulating them. He knew their weaknesses, their families, their secrets. He gave the illusion of intimacy. Guys like Patsy Parisi, who had every reason to hate him after his brother was whacked, were disarmed not by Tony's threats, but by his personal charm. There's also the truth that nobody could build a coalition strong enough to move against him. Tony's empire was small, but tightly woven. He deliberately kept everyone divided, never letting too much loyalty accumulate in any one direction. The idea of an organized coup wasn't just dangerous. It was impossible. No one trusted anyone else enough to make it happen. Even if someone wanted to, they'd have to wonder, who's listening? Who's reporting back to Tony? The paranoia that Tony himself lived with infected everyone below him. And yet there's a more subtle reason that explains why no one took that final step. Tony's relatability. Unlike someone like Richie, who came back from prison with raw, violent energy, Tony had evolved into something more modern. A boss who could play both worlds. He could whack someone in the woods one day and talk about Prozac the next. That made him human to his crew. They saw their own flaws in him, and that connection, even if it was toxic, made him oddly sympathetic. You don't whack a man you still half believe could change. It's also important to recognize how the show portrays violence itself. Not as random, but ritualistic. Every time someone gets whacked, it means something. It's a symbolic act meant to restore balance. Tony, however, always managed to keep that balance just intact enough that killing him wouldn't solve anything. The men around him might have hated him, but they knew that removing Tony would only bring chaos. And in the mob, chaos is worse than tyranny. Even Carmela, who emotionally abandoned him more than once, never truly turned on him. Because even she understood, consciously or not, that Tony's survival was tied to everyone's stability. If Tony fell, the entire structure fell with him. It wasn't just that people didn't want him dead, it's that they couldn't afford for him to die. By the end, Tony's paranoia reaches its peak. He's alienated almost everyone, yet nobody moves against him. That's the paradox. He's both feared and untouchable, hated and indispensable. His survival becomes more symbolic than literal. It represents how corruption sustains itself. Not because it's strong, but because it keeps everyone else weaker. And so, when you think about why nobody ever tried to whack Tony seriously, not just with empty talk or fleeting resentment, but a real, organized move, the answer isn't just power or fear. It's a web of interdependence. Tony created a system where every man's survival depended on his continued existence. They didn't protect him because they loved him. They protected him because they needed him. Tony's biggest weapon wasn't his gun or his crew. It was his understanding of human weakness. He knew that as long as people were hungry, insecure, or afraid, they'd never unite against him. He didn't need to control their loyalty. He only needed to control their options. That's why, even at his lowest, even when his world was crumbling, nobody came for him. The only threats came from outsiders, or from fate itself, never from within. In a way, that's what makes Tony such a fascinating study in leadership. He ruled not by building loyalty, but by breaking autonomy. He made sure no one was ever strong enough or trusted enough to challenge him. He turned every ally into a hostage of circumstance. And by the time anyone realized it, they were already too deep inside his web to climb out. The tragedy is that Tony himself never felt secure. He lived with the constant fear that someone somewhere was waiting to make their move. Every look, every whisper, every quiet dinner could have been the last. But that paranoia is what kept him alive. He anticipated betrayal so intensely that he prevented it before it could form. His own anxiety became his armor. In the end, the The reason nobody whacked Tony isn't that he was too powerful. It's that he was too necessary. He was the gravitational center of his entire world. Every life in his orbit revolved around him, and removing him would have meant total collapse. For all the talk about loyalty and respect, what really kept Tony safe was fear, need, and inertia.
And when you look even deeper at why Tony remained untouched for so long, you start to understand that the answer isn't just fear, loyalty, dependency, or myth. Those are the surface layers. Beneath them lies the real engine that kept Tony alive. The entire structure of his world was built in a way that discouraged decisive action. Everyone around him was too fragmented, too self-interested, too cautious, too paranoid, or too emotionally compromised to take that final step. Tony didn't survive because he was the strongest. He survived because everyone else was too divided to unite around anything that required real backbone. Almost every man who could have challenged Tony had a fatal flaw that prevented it. Richie had ego, but no patience. Ralph had brains, but no loyalty. Junior had position, but no clarity. Christopher had ambition, but no discipline. Paulie had loyalty, but too much superstition. Silvio had intelligence, but no desire to lead. Bobby had conscience, but no stomach for unnecessary conflict. Patsy had motive, but no backing. Every potential threat came with a built-in weakness, and Tony knew how to exploit them before they even recognized their own limitations. Tony's greatest instinct wasn't sensing betrayal. It was sensing insecurity. He could see the gaps inside men long before they saw them in themselves. He could sniff out fear like a predator. He knew exactly who needed validation, who needed money, who needed power, who needed affection, and who needed fear. That ability allowed him to create a psychological map of his entire crew. And once you understand a man's fears, you no longer have to fear the man. This is why Tony seemed impossible to take down. People weren't just afraid of what he could do physically. They were afraid of what he could see emotionally. A boss who can predict your moves before you make them is a boss you never plot against. Tony weaponized emotional intelligence. He read men better than they read themselves. He could talk Paulie down from his paranoia. He could reel Christopher back in with promises of trust and affection. He could give Patsy just enough recognition to keep him from spiraling. He could soothe Silvio with order and direction. Every man had a leash, and Tony held all of them. But it wasn't only the men under him who reinforced his survival. The New York families played a massive part in the unspoken rule that Tony shouldn't be touched. They didn't always respect him, but they respected the position. Taking out a boss without a full-scale war is nearly impossible, and nobody wanted a war with New Jersey. Not because Jersey was stronger, but because wars cost money, bodies, and stability. Even Carmine Sr., with all his influence, saw no value in destabilizing Tony's regime. It was easier to tolerate him, negotiate with him, or manipulate him than to eliminate him. New York viewed Tony as someone they could predict. That predictability is currency in the underworld. They understood his impulses, his patterns, his limits. They knew he wasn't aiming to swallow New York territory. They knew he wasn't secretly building connections to the West Coast. They knew he wasn't working with the feds. He was loud, emotional, impulsive, but fundamentally containable. That made him safer to keep alive than to remove. Tony's survival also depended on timing. Every moment where someone might have made a move happened during periods when Tony had just enough strength or the rival had just enough weakness to make action impossible. When Ralph was at his peak arrogance, Tony was still in control. When Richie challenged him, Richie had no crew and no alliances. When Junior turned against him, Tony had the entire younger generation behind him. When Johnny Sack grew stronger, Tony strategically grew weaker, becoming the man who negotiated, the man who compromised, the man who didn't threaten New York's long-term vision. By the time Phil Leotardo became a serious threat, Tony had survived too much for any internal plotting to matter. The internal option had expired. If Tony was ever going to be removed, it would have to be from the outside, and that's exactly what the finale suggests. The internal world had become too conditioned to Tony's dominance. They were psychologically incapable of seeing him as someone who could be toppled from within. It had to be a force outside their emotional conditioning. But beyond all the strategic and psychological frameworks, Tony's survival also relied on something surprisingly simple. Most mob guys aren't revolutionaries. They don't dream big. They don't envision new structures or long-term takeovers. They don't want to lead. They want to eat. The daily grind of earning for the boss is enough for most of them. They're not thinkers. They're not planners. They're not visionaries. They live paycheck to paycheck, crisis to crisis, and decision to decision. You cannot expect a man who barely manages his own gambling debts to suddenly organize a coup against the boss of an entire crime family. This is why Tony seemed untouchable, not because he was unbeatable, but because nobody in his world had the intellectual courage or the organizational skill to build a plot that could realistically succeed. And even if one of them did imagine it, the sheer paranoia inside the crew made it impossible to trust anyone else with the plan. Mobsters trust no one, which means they cannot build conspiracies larger than themselves. And one man alone cannot whack a boss without guarantees of protection. No guarantee means no action. So the idea dies before it even becomes a plan. If you add in Tony's money flow, his political connections, his FBI informant awareness, and his personal charisma, his survival becomes even more understandable. Tony wasn't just a boss. He was a provider. He paid medical bills. He covered funeral costs. He handed out envelopes. He gave loans. He fixed problems. He bailed people out. He made men feel important. A man who feeds you is harder to hate. A man who knows your kid's name is harder to plot against. A man who gives you a livelihood becomes a part of your identity. And killing your identity is emotional suicide. Tony's emotional intelligence extended even further. He had a gift for making every betrayal feel like the ultimate sin. He knew how to guilt people, how to make them feel disloyal just for imagining disobedience. He made loyalty feel like morality. He made betrayal feel like damnation. His crew wasn't loyal because they respected him. They were loyal because they feared who they would be without him. And somewhere in that dynamic lies the deeper truth. Nobody tried to whack Tony because nobody could imagine the world after Tony. The future without him seemed too abstract, too chaotic, too empty. Tony had positioned himself not just as the boss, but as the anchor of their entire universe. A universe without Tony would mean a collapse of identity, order, routine, and meaning. If you're a man like Paulie, who spent his entire life following orders, what happens when the order giver disappears? Paulie didn't just fear Tony, he feared the vacuum Tony's death would create. Even the younger guys treated Tony like a force of nature. They didn't like him, but they respected the gravitational pull of his personality. The idea of whacking him felt unnatural, like trying to remove the sky. More than once, characters imply that Tony is the last of a certain kind of boss. As long as he's alive, the old codes, the old rhythms, the old traditions still exist. But killing him would mean killing the last bridge to a world that was already fading. This is why even his biggest mistakes didn't lead to mutiny. When he beat up his own guys, they justified it. When he shorted people, they swallowed it. When he made selfish decisions that risked everyone, they rationalized it. They told themselves that Tony was still the best option. They convinced themselves that things could be worse. And as long as men convince themselves things could be worse, they never attempt change. It's also worth noting that Tony's unpredictability protected him. Most mob bosses are predictable tyrants. Tony was unpredictable in ways that made him dangerous to challenge. He could cry with you one moment and beat you half to death the next. He could shower you with gifts and then accuse you of betrayal in the same week. That emotional instability created hesitation. How do you plot against a man whose reactions you cannot predict? How do you guarantee your survival after making the first move when the man you're plotting against might sense the danger before you even commit to the thought? Tony's unpredictability wasn't a flaw. It was a shield. A stable tyrant is easier to kill than a volatile one. A volatile one forces you to question every step, every alliance, every idea. The constant uncertainty paralyzed the crew. They didn't know which version of Tony they'd face if the truth ever leaked out. And then there's the role of guilt, the most underrated form of control Tony possessed. Many of the men around him felt emotionally indebted to him. Christopher owed him his life, literally and figuratively. Paulie owed him his identity. Silvio owed him his position. Adriana's trajectory, although tragic, reinforced the rule. Tony's will was final. If Tony was capable of making even the women in his crew disappear without hesitation, what chance did any man have? Another layer of Tony's survival comes from the fact that he rarely allowed anyone to achieve true independence. Every man was kept in a state of partial dependency. Paulie needed validation. Christopher needed mentorship. Silvio needed direction. Patsy needed calm. Bobby needed peace. Vito needed protection. Carlo needed opportunity. No one's life was stable enough for them to take the risk of killing the man who held the only blueprint to their survival. Tony also mastered the timing of his own violence. He whacked people at the perfect emotional moment, not too early, not too late. He never looked hesitant. Hesitation breeds rebellion. Tony acted fast and decisively when he needed to send a message. Ralphie didn't just die because Tony hated him. Ralphie died because his death reinforced Tony's dominance at a moment when people were questioning his authority. Every violent act Tony committed had a psychological purpose, even if he wasn't fully conscious of it. The effect was the same. Men saw what happened to those who annoyed him too much, questioned him too often, or became liabilities. And yet, despite all the fear, all the myth, all the manipulation, there's an even deeper reason nobody ever truly tried to whack him. The story of Tony Soprano is the story of a man held in place by the dysfunction of everyone around him. His survival wasn't the triumph of strength. It was the triumph of broken systems. Tony lived because everyone else was too damaged to imagine a world without him. His world was shaped by men who couldn't organize themselves out of a paper bag. Men who were loyal to their own weaknesses. Men who found comfort in routine, even if that routine was built on corruption and misery. Men who preferred a bad leader to the possibility of no leader at all. Tony survived because everyone else needed him more than they hated him. He survived because the system was too fragile to withstand change. He survived because the men around him weren't brave enough or smart enough to envision something different. He survived because fear, myth, nostalgia, and dependency formed a net that held him above danger until the very end. And that's why the cut to black is so powerful. Because Tony's death could never come from inside his own house. If it came at all, it had to come from the outside world. Only an outside force, New York, a hired gun, fate, could break the spell Tony spent a lifetime creating.